The bruise on Sarah's cheek had turned purple by the time she reached the edge of town. Her dress was torn at the shoulder, and dried blood caked the corner of her mouth. Behind her, 3 days of walking had put distance between her and the monster she'd called husband. Ahead, nothing but prairie grass stretched to meet the sky. She had stolen away in darkness, taking only what she could carry. A small bag held one spare dress, a few coins, and her mother's silver locket. Everything else belonged to another life, one she prayed never to see again. The Missouri town where she'd lived for 2 miserable years was now just a memory of pain. Thomas had seemed kind when they met. He spoke softly in church and tipped his hat to ladies on the street. But kindness was a mask he wore for the world. Behind closed doors, his fist spoke a different language. For months, Sarah had hidden the marks beneath long sleeves and high collars. She'd smiled through split lips and blamed her limp on clumsiness. The night she finally ran, he'd raised a fireplace poker above his head. She saw death in his eyes and something broke inside her. Not her spirit, but her fear. She waited until his drunken snoring filled their bedroom, then slipped into the night like a ghost. Now the afternoon sun beat down without mercy. Her canteen was nearly empty, and the last town had disappeared beyond the horizon hours ago. Sarah knew she was walking into dangerous territory. Everyone spoke of the Indian lands ahead with hushed warnings and fearful glances. But she reasoned that any danger out here was better than the certain death waiting back home. As twilight painted the sky orange and gold, she spotted movement in the distance. Her heart hammered against her ribs. A group of riders approached, moving fast across the open plain. She thought about running but knew it was useless. Her legs were already shaking with exhaustion. The riders were Lakota warriors, that much became clear as they drew near. Their horses were magnificent, and the men sat tall in their saddles with an ease that spoke of lives lived in the open air. Sarah stood frozen as they circled her, their faces unreadable. One man rode forward from the group. He was older than the others, with streaks of gray in his long black hair. Feathers decorated his clothing, and he carried himself with unmistakable authority. His dark eyes studied her face, taking in every bruise and cut. Sarah expected mockery or worse. Instead, she saw something unexpected flash across his features. Recognition, perhaps. Not of her specifically, but of what had been done to her. His jaw tightened as his gaze moved from her swollen cheek to her torn dress to her bleeding feet. He spoke to his men in their own language, his voice firm but not harsh. Then he looked back at Sarah and extended his hand. She understood the gesture even without words. He was offering help, not harm. Every warning she'd ever heard about Indians screamed in her mind. But those warnings came from the same people who'd walked past her house and ignored her cries. The same neighbors who'd seen her bruises and turned away. This stranger, this man from a world completely different from her own, was the first person to truly see her suffering. Sarah reached up and took his hand. His grip was strong but gentle as he pulled her up behind him on his horse. As they rode toward the setting sun, she allowed herself to hope for the first time in years. She didn't know where they were going or what would happen next. She only knew that every step of the horse carried her farther from hell and closer to something that felt almost like salvation. The other warriors rode alongside them in silence, and Sarah closed her eyes against the chief's broad back, finally allowing exhaustion to claim her. Sarah woke to the smell of smoke and cooking meat. She lay on soft furs inside a structure made of animal hides stretched over wooden poles. Sunlight filtered through the seams, creating patterns of light and shadow that danced across her vision. For a moment, panic seized her as she struggled to remember where she was. Then it came back. The endless walking, the riders, the chief with gray-streaked hair who'd lifted her onto his horse. She sat up quickly and immediately regretted it as pain shot through her battered body. Every muscle screamed from days of walking and nights of sleeping on hard ground. The entrance flap opened and a woman entered carrying a wooden bowl. She was perhaps 40 years old, with kind eyes and weathered hands that spoke of hard work. She gestured for Sarah to lie back down and began examining her injuries with practiced efficiency. The woman's touch was gentle as she cleaned wounds and applied a cool paste that smelled of unfamiliar herbs. Sarah wanted to speak, to say thank you, to ask 1,000 questions. But the language barrier stood between them like a wall. Instead, she tried to communicate with her eyes, hoping gratitude could transcend words. The woman seemed to understand. She smiled and patted Sarah's hand before offering the bowl of warm broth. Over the next few days, Sarah learned the rhythms of the camp. She was staying in the lodge of the woman who tended her wounds. Her name sounded like Morning Bird when the chief said it, though Sarah wasn't sure she heard it correctly. Morning Bird had lost her own daughter to sickness 2 winters past, and something in Sarah's battered state had awakened her mothering instincts. The chief visited each day. His name was Stands with Thunder, and he led this band of Lakota with wisdom earned through 5 decades of life. He brought a younger man named Swift Hawk who spoke broken English learned from traders. Through this halting translation, Sarah began to tell her story. She explained about Thomas and the beatings, about the night she'd fled with nothing but her life. Swift Hawk translated in low tones, and she watched Stands with Thunder's expression darken with each detail. When she finished, he spoke at length in Lakota. Swift Hawk turned to her with serious eyes. Chief says your husband is less than man. Real man protects woman, not hurts. Chief says you are safe here. No one will hurt you. Swift Hawk paused, searching for words. He says you are under his protection now. This is sacred promise. Tears streamed down Sarah's face before she could stop them. In her entire married life, no one had protected her. No one had cared enough to intervene. This stranger, this man from a culture she'd been taught to fear, had given her something her own people never had, sanctuary. As her strength returned, Sarah began helping Morning Bird with daily tasks. She learned to scrape hides and prepare food in ways completely foreign to her upbringing. The other women watched her with curiosity but not unkindness. Children stared openly until their mother scolded them, then they smiled shyly when Sarah waved. Stands with Thunder continued his daily visits. He brought Swift Hawk less frequently now, seeming content to simply sit near her in companionable silence. Sometimes he carved wood while she helped Morning Bird sew. Other times he told stories she couldn't understand, but his voice was soothing and she found herself relaxing in his presence. One evening, he arrived with a dress made of soft doeskin decorated with intricate beadwork. Morning Bird helped her put it on, exclaiming with pleasure at how well it fit. Sarah caught her reflection in a basin of water and barely recognized herself. The bruises had faded to yellow shadows. Her eyes had lost their haunted look. She almost looked peaceful. Stands with Thunder said something in Lakota, his voice carrying a weight that needed no translation. Morning Bird giggled like a young girl and hurried from the lodge, leaving them alone. He stepped closer and gently touched the doeskin sleeve of the dress he'd commissioned for her. Sarah understood then what she'd been trying not to see. This powerful chief looked at her not with pity, but with something deeper. Something that made her heart race with feelings she'd thought dead forever. Summer deepened into long golden days and warm nights filled with stars. Sarah's hands grew calloused from honest work, and her body grew strong from clean living and plentiful food. The Lakota camp moved twice to follow the buffalo herds, and each time Sarah helped pack and carry like every other woman. She was no longer a guest but something closer to family. Her friendship with Stands with Thunder deepened in ways that both thrilled and terrified her. He began teaching her Lakota words, laughing gently when her tongue tangled around unfamiliar sounds. She taught him more English, and their conversations grew longer and more meaningful. He told her about his first wife, dead now for 10 years, and his 2 grown sons who led their own families. She shared memories of her childhood before Thomas, before fear became her constant companion. The attraction between them was undeniable. Sarah felt it every time he smiled at her, every time their hands accidentally touched. But shame held her tongue. She was still married in the eyes of God and law, even if that marriage had been nothing but chains and suffering. What kind of woman was she to feel desire for another man while Thomas still lived? One afternoon, she confided these fears to Morning Bird through gestures and the limited words they now shared. The older woman listened patiently, then spoke at length in Lakota. She called Swift Hawk over to translate properly. Morning Bird says white man's marriage is broken thing if it brings only pain. She says Creator does not want women to suffer. She says your spirit was dead with bad husband, but Chief has brought it back to life. This is gift from Creator, not sin. Swift Hawk paused, looking uncomfortable. She says Chief loves you. Everyone sees it. She asks why you make him wait. The directness of it shocked Sarah into silence. In her world, such things were never spoken aloud. But these people lived with an honesty that her society lacked. They saw love as natural as breathing and saw no reason to hide from truth. That evening, Stands with Thunder invited her to walk beyond the camp. They climbed a small hill as the sun set, painting the endless prairie in shades of crimson and gold. At the top, he spread a blanket and they sat together watching the day die and the stars emerge. He spoke in Lakota, his voice low and intense. Sarah caught perhaps 1 word in 5, but she understood his meaning from the way he looked at her. When he finished, he waited, giving her space to respond. Sarah's heart thundered so loud she thought he must surely hear it. She was 30 years old and had known only one man's touch, and that had been violent and cruel. The thought of intimacy terrified her, Yet something in Stands with Thunder's steady gaze made her feel safe in ways she'd never experienced. She reached out and took his hand, weaving her fingers through his. "I'm still afraid," she whispered in English, knowing he wouldn't understand all the words but trusting he would grasp the emotion. "But I want to try. With you, I want to try." He smiled then, a smile that transformed his serious face into something younger and full of joy. He raised her hand to his lips and kissed it gently, a gesture of respect that brought tears to her eyes. Then he spoke again, and though she didn't understand the words, she heard the promise in them. They sat together as darkness claimed the sky, neither speaking, just being together. Below them, campfires dotted the prairie like fallen stars. Somewhere a drum began to beat, and voices rose in song. Sarah leaned against Stands with Thunder's solid warmth and felt something miraculous happening inside her chest. Hope was growing there, fragile as a seedling but real. For the first time in years, she could imagine a future that didn't include pain. She could imagine mornings without dread and nights without terror. She could imagine being loved the way a woman deserved to be loved. When they finally walked back to camp, his hand stayed on the small of her back, protective and possessive in the best possible way. Morning Bird saw them approaching and her face split into a knowing grin. The other women noticed too, and Sarah saw approval in their eyes. She was crossing a threshold tonight, leaving behind not just Thomas but everything her old life represented. Tomorrow she would wake in a new world with new possibilities. And she would wake beside a man who saw her worth. The Council of Elders met under the full moon to discuss the matter of Stands with Thunder and the White Woman. Sarah waited outside the circle with the other women, her stomach twisted with anxiety. Morning Bird sat beside her, radiating confidence, but Sarah couldn't shake her fear that they would reject her. Swift Hawk emerged after an hour and approached her with careful steps. "They have questions," he said. "They want to know if you come to our people honestly, if you understand what it means to be Lakota wife." Sarah stood on shaking legs and followed him to the fire. 12 men sat in a semicircle, their faces painted with shadows and firelight. Stands with Thunder sat among them, but he didn't look at her. This was a formal proceeding, and he had to remain impartial while his people decided. The eldest, a man called Walks Far, spoke first. Swift Hawk translated his words. "You ran from white husband. How do we know you will not run from Lakota husband when things become difficult? How do we know you will honor our ways?" The question was fair, and Sarah had prepared for it. "I didn't run from difficulty," she said clearly. "I ran from death. My white husband beat me until I could barely stand. He broke my ribs and blackened my eyes. I stayed for 2 years before I finally fled, so no one can say I gave up easily." She paused, gathering courage. "I won't run from Stands with Thunder because he has shown me what a real man is. He protects instead of hurts. He honors instead of shames. I would be proud to stand beside him." Another elder spoke, his voice sharp with skepticism. "You know nothing of our ways. You cannot speak our language. How will you teach Lakota children if you cannot speak to them?" "I learn more each day," Sarah replied. "Morning Bird teaches me. The children teach me. I may never speak perfectly, but I will speak well enough. And I will make sure any children I have know both worlds. They will be bridges between our people." The questions continued for an hour. They asked about her skills, her beliefs, her willingness to embrace Lakota spirituality while keeping whatever faith she chose to maintain. They asked if she understood that marrying Stands with Thunder meant casting her lot completely with the Lakota, that she could never return to white society without being scorned as a squaw woman. To every question, Sarah answered honestly. She didn't pretend to know more than she did. She admitted her fears but also her determination. She spoke from her heart, and Swift Hawk translated her words with care. Finally, Walks Far raised his hand for silence. He looked at Stands with Thunder and spoke directly to him in Lakota. The chief responded in kind, his voice steady and strong. Sarah caught her own name and a word she'd learned, love. Walks Far nodded slowly, then turned to Sarah. When he spoke, his voice had lost its sharp edge. Swift Hawk translated with a smile. "Elder says Stands with Thunder has led our people well for 20 years. He says if Chief chooses you, then you must have worth that not everyone can see. He says you may marry, but you must prove yourself worthy through actions, not just words." Relief flooded through Sarah's body so intensely she nearly collapsed. Morning Bird caught her arm, laughing and crying at the same time. The other women rushed forward, surrounding her with congratulations and well wishes. Stands with Thunder finally looked at her, and the love in his eyes made her forget every hard moment that had led to this one. The wedding ceremony took place 3 days later at dawn. It was nothing like the church wedding Sarah had endured with Thomas. There were no witnesses in uncomfortable clothes, no boring sermon, no feeling of being trapped. Instead, the entire camp gathered in a circle around them. Stands with Thunder wore ceremonial clothing decorated with quill work and feathers. Sarah wore the white doeskin dress that Morning Bird and the other women had spent days creating. It was the most beautiful thing she'd ever owned. The ceremony was conducted in Lakota, so Sarah understood little of what was said. But she didn't need translation to grasp the meaning when Stands with Thunder took her hands and spoke vows that made the elders nod with approval. She repeated words Swift Hawk had taught her, promising to honor her husband and their people. When it was done, Stands with Thunder wrapped a blanket around both their shoulders, binding them together. The camp erupted in celebration. Drums pounded and people danced. Food appeared as if by magic, and everyone ate until they could hold no more. As night fell, Stands with Thunder led Sarah to a new lodge set apart from the others, prepared specially for them. Inside, furs covered the ground and a small fire burned in the center. He closed the entrance flap and turned to face her. Sarah's hands trembled as he approached. He must have seen her fear because he stopped and simply held out his hand, waiting for her to come to him in her own time. Sarah took his hand and let him pull her close. His arms encircled her with strength tempered by gentleness, and she felt the last of her fear begin to dissolve. He spoke softly in Lakota, words she was learning meant beautiful and precious and mine. His hands moved to her face, cradling it like something fragile and valuable. When he kissed her, it was nothing like Thomas's brutal claiming. This was patient and seeking, asking rather than demanding. Sarah felt something unfold inside her chest, some locked room opening to let in light. She kissed him back, letting her body say what her limited words could not. They made love slowly, and Stands with Thunder proved as considerate in intimacy as he was in everything else. He watched her face constantly, reading every expression, stopping when she tensed and continuing when she relaxed. For the first time in her life, Sarah understood that this act could be about connection rather than power, about giving rather than taking. Afterward, they lay together in the firelight, her head on his chest listening to his heartbeat. He stroked her hair and spoke in a mixture of Lakota and broken English, telling her about the life they would build together. She understood enough to know he was making plans, thinking about their future with the certainty of a man who had finally found what he'd been missing. Sarah fell asleep feeling safer than she ever had, wrapped in the arms of a man who valued her above all things. When she woke in the morning to find him watching her with a soft smile, she smiled back without hesitation. The months that followed brought challenges Sarah hadn't anticipated. Learning Lakota ways was harder than she'd expected. She burned food over unfamiliar fires and sewed moccasins that fell apart after one wearing. She accidentally insulted an elder by not understanding proper protocols. But through every mistake, the women helped her and Stands with Thunder supported her with infinite patience. Winter came hard and early that year. The camp moved to sheltered valleys where the wind couldn't reach them so easily. Sarah learned to make the lodge warm and comfortable, to store food properly, to read weather signs in the sky. Stands with Thunder taught her to track animals in the snow and showed her how to read the land like a story. In the deep cold months, scouts brought troubling news. White settlers were pushing farther west, and the army was building new forts on land promised to the Lakota. Stands with Thunder attended council after council, his face growing more troubled with each report. Sarah understood enough now to grasp the danger. The world she'd left behind was creeping closer, threatening to destroy the peace she'd found. She thought about Thomas sometimes, wondering if he'd looked for her, hoping he'd assumed her dead or lost. The idea of him finding her filled her with cold dread. One night, she shared these fears with her husband. He listened carefully, then spoke with fierce intensity. "You are Lakota now. Your old name is gone. Your old life is dead. If white men come, they will see only chief's wife, not runaway woman. I will protect you until my last breath." His words comforted her, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that their happiness existed on borrowed time. She pushed the worry aside and focused on the present, on the life growing inside her that she'd recently confirmed with Morning Bird. When she told Stands with Thunder about the baby, he lifted her off the ground and spun her around, laughing with pure joy. That night, he gathered the entire camp and announced the news. The celebration lasted until dawn, and Sarah fell asleep exhausted but happier than she'd ever imagined possible. Spring brought green grass and new life. Sarah's belly swelled as the earth warmed. She worked alongside the other women, preparing for the child that would arrive when summer reached its peak. Stands with Thunder became almost comically protective, trying to prevent her from doing anything strenuous until she finally told him firmly that pregnant women had been working since the beginning of time. The baby came on a hot August night with Morning Bird and 3 other women attending. Labor was hard and long, but when Sarah finally heard her daughter's first cry, every moment of pain was forgotten. Stands with Thunder was allowed in to meet his child, and the look on his face when he held his tiny daughter was something Sarah would treasure forever. They named her Dawn Breaks Softly, because she was born as the sun rose and because she represented a new beginning for both of them. The baby had her mother's light eyes and her father's dark hair, a perfect blend of 2 worlds. As Sarah held her daughter and watched Stands with Thunder stroke the baby's tiny hand, she thought about the long journey that had brought her here. She'd fled violence and shame expecting nothing but survival. Instead, she'd found a home among people who valued her, a husband who cherished her, and a future full of hope. The white world she'd left behind would never understand her choice. They would call her a squaw woman and say she'd been captured or corrupted. But Sarah knew the truth. She hadn't been captured. She'd been freed. She hadn't been corrupted. She'd been redeemed. Outside the lodge, the camp was waking to a new day. Children laughed and played. Women sang as they worked. Men prepared for a hunt. Life continued in its ancient patterns, and Sarah was part of it now. She belonged to this place and these people in ways she'd never belonged anywhere before. Stands with Thunder met her eyes over their daughter's head and smiled. No words were needed. They both knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. Sarah had fled violence and shame, and the Lakota chief had given her home and heart. In return, she had given him the same, and together they had created something beautiful and lasting. The future was uncertain, but the present was perfect. And for now, that was more than enough.